Hello and welcome to Founders Amplified, where we spotlight underrepresented founders who are driving innovation and impact across various industries and sectors across the globe. I'm your host, Narayan Kulkarni, and I'm excited to be here with you today. Today's bonus episode is a special interview featuring a unique co-founder team sharing their authentic approach to driving innovation and impact. Sister duo Dr. Zahra Khosroshahi, who uses she/her pronouns, and Hanieh Khosroshahi, who also uses she/her pronouns, were born in Tehran, Iran, and grew up in Toronto, Canada. Hanieh is an independent design consultant working in social impact and digital innovation. Zahra is a lecturer in film and television studies at the University of Glasgow, UK, researching gender and Iranian cinema. In May 2021, they co-founded 1001, a global feminist community that supports women of color to thrive in their personal and professional lives. In this unique bonus episode, you'll see both Zahra and Hanieh together in one screen during a unique conversation that emphasizes the importance of care, community, and consciousness as praxis. And by doing so, we're collectively expanding the depth of what it means to amplify underrepresented founders by emphasizing the layers of solidarity and spaciousness that regenerate and enable truly incredible innovation and impact. So, now that you know a little bit more about what to expect in this bonus episode, let's dive in to the conversation. Welcome to Founders Amplified, Hanieh and Zahra. It's great to have you both with us today. How are you doing?
We're good. Thank you for having us. We're as good as one can be in these very testing times, but we are good and we are here.
Yeah, doing well, thanks.
You're both most welcome, and thanks again for being here. So to kick things off, I'd love to learn a little bit more about your journeys. So can you tell me what led you to become co-founders, and were there any moments or experiences that sparked the decision?
Yeah. So we founded 1001 in 2021, and at the time it was peak COVID. I was 6 years into a career as a designer in tech, and I was working on an article for Stanford Social Innovation Review where I was talking about this concept of the concrete ceiling based on my own challenges of being a racialized woman. And the concrete ceiling comes from Victoria Sapan's 2015 thesis on the black ceiling. So it basically talks about the combination of racial and gender injustices and challenges that one might go through. And so as I was writing that article, I also was reflecting with Zahra about some of the challenges we experience in our respective fields when it comes to being both women as well as racialized. And, this was the first year in a very long time where we were also living in the same city. For our entire lives, we had leaned on each other for support, and our sisterhood was a really strong foundation of being able to navigate some of these workplace challenges and also life challenges, personal challenges, whether it was on the streets protesting, whether it was at work, whether it was on a soccer field. And so we really were thinking about like what happens if we kind of scale this? What happens if we create a community where we can provide this level of support and community to fellow women of color? And so in May of that year, we kind of decided to co-found 1001, and it was kind of driven out of this both a need and a desire, the need to kind of support women of color going through similar things that we had gone through, and this desire to build a community by us and for us, because we had seen that that's a major gap in most of the solutions that are put forward in our for us.
Okay, well said. I appreciate hearing the intentionality around specifically supporting women of color. And so I'd love to know a little bit more about that. So are there any specific parts of your identity, say being women of color, other parts of your identity, or other parts of your story that you feel give you a unique perspective in what you're doing with 1001?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll speak to that. So our positionality as both of us being immigrants to Toronto, Turtle Island, as well as to racialized women growing up in post 9/11, as Muslim women, as Iranian women, as two Iranian women who've also been very much invested in the social justice movements of our country of birth, Iran, being very much invested in that fight as well, and our sisterhood. So all these kind of aspects of our identities have really come together to become 1001, which also is what inspires the name. So the name kind of references the story of narrative and survival and Shahrzad. And so all of that kind of holds together our experiences, our identities, but also what we hope to put forward for our communities. I think our unique positionality of kind of being in between these spaces allows us to connect with our demographic as well. Not ever to say that when we use the word woman of color, that it's this kind of monolith or that it speaks to all of our experiences. I think one thing that we've really been intentional about is recognizing that, woman of color is an umbrella term. It has absolute severe limitations that we don't want to erase. And that was kind of the first post we wrote about, is that what's in a name, and that we recognize these limitations, but how about we think about the intersections of our identities, of our struggles, of our joy, and to kind of borrow bell hooks and her idea around how in marginal spaces resistance takes place. And so how about we all kind of meet in those spaces and use that as a way to navigate some of these challenges. So we bring in our own unique positionality, but also our community brings their own. And it's kind of about how we meet there to kind of fight for social justice issues.
Well said. And I will say the part of being an immigrant post 9/11, that does resonate with me because I grew up in the US post 9/11. That affected me, even though I'm not Muslim, I'm Hindu, I'm Indian. That affected the way that people saw me. That also very much affected the way that I grew up. And to your point about women of color, that is a gigantic umbrella term. There's so much nuance within just women in general, and like women's experiences. So yes, I've seen and heard from previous guests as well as like many people in my life about like all of the various the breadth of women's experiences. So I appreciate that you're also addressing and mentioning that in the context of what you're doing. Now, the next question I'd love to know more about is, so you've talked about like there are challenges that face women of color, both collectively and individually. Can you talk a little bit more about what you believe stands in the way for women of color?
Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. I think there's a lot. I think for me, it's about, what stands in our way as individuals navigating our personal lives, our communities, our families, and then the layers beyond that would be work and the professional sphere. And 1001 originally kind of started with this idea of like our challenges specifically in our professional lives. But we very quickly kind of pivoted, understanding that the personal and the professional are not as distinct for us as maybe other kind of as other people. They bleed into one another, they impact one another. And so if something in our professional lives is impacting us, we take that into the personal. If something in our personal lives is impacting us, then that naturally shows up in the professional. So I would say that tension is probably the biggest thing that stands in our way, that all these things that we've heard in our careers as to like show up as your authentic self, or don't bring politics into the workplace. Those types of things are not only irrelevant to our kind of lived reality, but they're also quite harmful, right? Because you cannot show up as your authentic self unless you're able to actually bring everything with that kind of exists within your ecosystem within into the workplace. And then specifically when we're talking about, let's say I'll give maybe an example of what stands in our way in the personal and one in the professional. In the professional, I would say that we are still experiencing a massive leadership gap, right? Like there are incredibly accomplished and talented, women of color who are very, very much advancing or want to advance in their careers, but they hit a gap, right? They hit a cap rather. And this is where the concrete ceiling comes, right? A massive part of the concrete ceiling is the fact that it's not a glass ceiling, it's concrete. You can't penetrate it, you can't break through it, right? It's concrete. And the metaphor kind of stands as a way to say that, especially in leadership positions, especially when we're looking at career progression and advancement, there is only so much we can do. And the reasons for that are plenty, right? But the fact is that across most industries you look at, women of color are not represented at the top, right? At the major decision-making tables. In our in our personal lives, I would say, there's a lot of conversations going on around like self and collective care. A lot of us are caregivers to our families. We come from communities where the collective is often very important. And then we go into like, especially the Western dominated world where it's like, you have to take care of yourself. And for us, that also kind of comes at this like massive tension and sometimes even sacrifice, right? So for us, I think just navigating some of these discrepancies within what we learn and believe in our communities, in our souls, in our through indigenous wisdom and practices, don't align with the capitalist Western kind of cultures that we operate in and the systems we exist in. So these systems were not built with us in mind naturally, and that really impacts how we show up just on a day-to-day in our personal lives and with our families and with our communities as well. Is there anything else, Zahra, that you think stands in the way?
I
I
mean,
may have missed, yeah.
yeah, like you said, there's a lot that we're missing because there's so many factors at play. And I think um, for a lot of our community members, we come from countries where that are under war and are struggling, and so we carry even in our bodies some of these triggers and traumas, right? And the dehumanization of brown and black bodies is not something that's new. It's something that the empire has kind of used, and I think this is what we're saying, what we're seeing, especially in this moment of kind of witnessing a live stream genocide, is that we're expected to show up to work as if things are okay, as if things are normal. And I think for us who are deeply invested in what happens in the region as two Iranian women, that's just virtually impossible, right? For me, my research is on Iranian cinema, and I think about gender on a day-to-day. And so to show up at work as if this whole situation isn't happening or that there isn't the dehumanization, the continuous war machine, is impossible. And so, like Hanieh said, there is always that, and it again goes back to the foundations of how we think about feminism, the interconnectedness of the personal and the professional and the political. These spheres all blend into each other. And for racialized women, and for a lot of racialized folks, the division of that is absolutely impossible. And so we need to take care of all those spheres to be able to kind of maintain any semblance of health and well-being, actually, or professionalism or growth. So it kind of there's always a trickle down effect.
Well said. Very, very deeply said. I appreciate specifically what you said about how each of these spheres are interdependent, not just interconnected, and things that influence one, positive or negative, will influence the others positive or negatively. So now I'd love to know more about, I appreciate hearing each of your unique, nuanced perspectives, and I'm curious how you bring that in 2001. So what's something about how you're approaching your work at 1001 that's very unique or different from, say, other organizations in the space?
So in some ways, we have different offerings, and we can kind of tell you a little bit about that first. So this started first as a community. So we thought of 1001 as a community space, and it was mostly initially focused on the professional sphere. So how do we support women of color in professional spaces? So we offered kind of workshops around naming some of those microaggressions or some of those kind of obstacles in our way, and then created with our community collective toolkits around how to navigate those. What's at the core of what we do is that we don't see ourselves as leaders per se. We are community members, and we kind of follow where the community leads. That's kind of our ethos, right? So we are working with our community, and what sets us apart, I think, is the fact that we see ourselves as part of that collective. How do we sit at a table with fellow women of color with those intersections of experiences and think about a better future for all of us? In the last 2 years, and with kind of our own political activism, we've also started to really think more about decolonial and anti-colonial approaches and methods, to think about, well, it's not just about the workplace. Actually, we're not really invested in conversations around DEI. We are much more kind of, our feminism is much more aligned with folks like Audre Lorde, who tell us that the entire house needs to be dismantled, that we're not trying to rethink of tools to work within the system, because the system has shown us that it has failed us, that it has never cared for us. And so we've kind of the last year has been a bit of a brave and honest conversation between the two of us and with our communities around how to actually dismantling. And so with that, we're thinking of how do we create braver spaces. We don't like the term safe spaces because again, we don't know what safety means in this moment, right? We are hoping for brave, curious spaces that are actually happy to name the issues at hand and to kind of work towards those. So right now we have other kind of offerings. One of them is quarterly meetups. We bring again a woman of color guest speaker who runs us through a specific theme. One of the ones that we had was around kind of creating community within this moment, these political moments. We had one around decolonization in practice. So what are the daily things we can do? What are collective practices we can kind of go back to think about decolonization on a day to day, but also to think about where we hold that power as a collective, right? In these, again, tiring times, in these violent times, how do we kind of take back some of that narrative ourselves? Yeah.
Okay, thanks for sharing. And so something which you mentioned, which I'd like to dive deeper on. You talked about how, of course, you're showing up for yourselves, but also for the collective. So how do you, I'd like to talk about the latter part of that. How do you make sure that you show up for your community and balance self-care and collective care in what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think 1001 is dedicated to showing up for the collective because we are firm believers in the dismantling of the self as a very decolonial approach towards collective liberation. And as such, I think, we kind of almost announce this notion of like self-care as, bubble baths or wine days with your besties, right? We mostly engage with this concept of oddly Lord about like caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is itself is an act of political warfare, right? She was quoted for saying that. And so in preserving the self, we join this call to kind of resist these systems of violence and to remember that the self and collective are intertwined, that our liberation is bound together. And so there's things that we practice through self-care that we definitely highlight because you cannot support the collective without taking care of yourself, mind, body, and soul. But the need to take care of the self is still in pursuit of the collective, is still in pursuit of the community. And so everything that we do is in pursuit of that. And some examples of that are, for example, we show up not just in times of crisis when we need to grieve and hold space, but also in moments of joy, right? I think joy, poetry, literature, these things are parts of activism and parts of our cultures and being that often get dismissed. And that we are only there to kind of talk about our grief and our rage, and not that those things are not, there's no space for that, but I think holding both together is incredibly, incredibly important. Yeah, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's revolutionary in a way to be able to hold space for the joy and the rage. And I think so much of our work is around balancing those, just like we try to balance the self and the collective. But I think our ethos ultimately, like with 1001, is that it's the systems that are the problem. So that I can sit here and do all the gym, the weight training programs and all the bubble baths and all of that, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we have starving children and that affects me and it affects my community and that it affects our world and it affects our climate and it affects children and the way that we show up and the way that our standards for the world has completely shifted. And so we often find that self-care is used as a almost a cop-out, as a way to say that, if I take a moment for myself to do the thing that makes me happy, that somehow all these problems are going to go away. And more than ever now, I think we're realizing that that's not the case, and that actually for us, where we feel most supported and most healed is again within community, is when we're marching, is when we're organizing, it's when we're dismantling, and that again there is joy also in the activism that we hold and we do.
And maybe I can provide one quick example. In just this past last month, in the Israeli bombing of Iran, our motherland, we were talking a lot with a fellow Iranian woman in the diaspora, and we were all, navigating a lot of diverse kind of emotions and really heavy emotions naturally.
Hmm.
And so, like, very quickly, we kind of pivoted and we decided to hold a support circle, emergency support circle for Iranian women in the diaspora. And through that session, we created space to kind of grieve together, read poetry from some of our feminist kind of poets. We did an exercise on future visioning about what Iran the day after might look like. So that's just one example of how we kind of respond to community needs, not just in on the average day, but whether we like it or not, our communities are navigating crisis situations as well, where we
Hmm.
need to pivot and we need to be adaptive to what their needs are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, very deep, well said. One thing that I appreciate you mentioned is a seeing, of course, self-care is joy that requires a very high
Mhm.
degree of empathy, that requires a very high degree of consciousness, and even in more quote unquote serious activities,
Yeah.
like for example, like discussions, etc., there can still be space for, depending on what is
Mm.
shared and how it's shared, joy. So
Yeah.
like I love the example you used of say poetry, and then going ahead and using
Mhm.
that as like a cathartic activity, and then interpreting it, and then like contextualizing that in a future way. So I appreciate the nuance around how you're talking about joy in the context of the more like in a more serious, more evolved form of what self care and collective care look like in that work. So thank you for sharing.
Mm.
Now, again, obviously, look, it sounds like looks like what you're doing is highly impactful in the present. But let's zoom out and go into the future, say like 5 or 10 years. What are you seeing then that shows you that what positive impacts you're seeing then that shows you that what you're doing with 1001 is working well?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I mean, this is top of mind for us, very, very much so. And I think
Yeah.
on the smallest scale, and since our launch, we've met some really incredible community members, some who we've collaborated with, some who've, read our newsletters, others attend a meetup or a workshop, and just simply hearing back and them saying, this really resonated, or I really needed this space, or when's the next one? When can we attend? Right? Just that to me is the most positive impact because we are hearing directly from the people that we've designed with and for, and that they're telling us to keep going, and this is needed. It's filling a much
Yeah.
needed gap, right? So I think on the most basic level, this is probably important that I think stands today. It was relevant 4 years ago when we launched, and it will still be incredibly important 5 years and 10 years from now. But I think at the core of that is building lasting relationships that are based on reciprocity and care, right? We are not in the business of just partnering with anybody. We are not in the business of
Mm.
creating workshops or trainings or, offerings that are not rooted in that like truly decolonial feminist, intersectional feminist approaches. And so building these partnerships 5 years, 10 years in the future that are really based on compassion, care, reciprocity, aligned values is something that we think is a truly a sign of impact and growth within the next 5, 10, or however many years. And then I would just say that I think impact for us is not just growth by numbers. How many numbers do you have in your newsletter or likes and things like that. I think we can get as founders we can get um, really wound up by those types of things, and I'll admit even I do, because those things, especially in the digital online world, being a remote kind of global organization, those things do matter to an extent, but we're really try to kind of decenter that
Yeah.
when it comes to measuring impact and defining success, because we think what's really important is like, what are we talking about when we say like how many women of color are we partnering and working with in terms of lived experience, diverse lived experiences, geographies, perspectives, strengths, and skill sets, right? And I think we're firm believers that that is a true mark of impact and success.
Well said. Appreciate your perspective on, well, of course, numbers being important, but I really appreciate that you're emphasizing quality, reciprocity of relationships, and
Hmm.
then being very, very intentional. It sounds like with who you are engaging with, how you're engaging with them over time. That, of course, is a different form of success than what is materially known out there, but arguably, in some ways of speaking, much more needed, and much more important
Mhm.
in certain contexts. So, thanks for sharing. So obviously, like in the past 4 years, I'm sure you've had lots of experiences, learned lots of different things. So what are a few things that you know now as founders that you wish you had known before you had started? I would love to hear maybe one from each of you.
Yeah. One of the biggest ones for me was there are challenges in working and joys in working with your sister. In the sense that we are extremely close. Also, in terms of age, we're 11 months apart. We've had very similar lived experiences, different industries, but different, very similar politics, exact same politics. Um, but I think in terms of our industries and our work ethics and habits, we're a little bit different, which has turned out to be an extremely incredible asset to the way that we show up and the way that we conduct 1001. But there were definitely learning curves with that to kind of treat each other not always as sisters, but as co-workers. Because I feel like if I was sitting in a meeting with an office mate, I might be a lot more patient than when I'm sitting there having a meeting with Hanieh. So I think learning that it's wonderful. It's the foundation of this is our sisterhood, but at times it's important to just bring in some professionalism. So that's something that's been which I think we've really improved on. Like we've really found the flow. And another thing is, I'll give a shout out to one of our first community members who came to one of our workshops in Toronto, Turtle Island, Sorabi, who then she's become like almost a mentor for us and has been really, really wonderful support. And she told us once we were having just like Thai food in Toronto, catching up, she was like, just remember, whatever you two have planned, wherever it fails or whatever promises you don't keep, we don't know it from the outside. It's completely, you are the one who are setting the pace for this enterprise, for this business, for this organization. So don't be so obsessed with how it looks from the outside. And I think that really, that we found that to be very validating. And it kind of made us think about the pace of our organization and think about what it is that we want and that it's okay for us to completely pivot. And so that was something that has really been instrumental in the last few years in terms of something that's really stuck with me. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think back to 4 years ago when we were starting, I almost didn't understand the degree to which as a founder you have control and autonomy over what you build, how you build, who you work with and whatnot, when you pivot, when you change, when you rebrand, the whole spiel. And I think for me, what I've really learned over a span of 4 years, and Zahra and I both, we've had full-time jobs, very demanding careers throughout this time. So we were almost forced to build 1001 slowly and intentionally. But over time, that became kind of our ethos as well, that we don't have to go at the pace of what, people say. You don't have to follow the rule book that's been written about how to build businesses or community organizations or whatnot. And I think something that I've really learned over the years has been that you have more control and autonomy than you even think, right? You get to build at your own pace, that you can grow and pivot where you feel is needed. And you get, there's a blessing that comes with being able to build all that in ways that you think is aligned to your values and your mission. And sometimes autonomy can come with this concept, with this fear and maybe even anxiety. But I think once we came out on the other side of it, we really now feel much more in control of where we take this organization, at what pace,
Yeah.
and what we get to kind of what we get to focus on.
Okay, great points from both of you. So, how can people find you and how can they support your work?
Yeah, so I'll mention a few things. So I think we have a monthly newsletter, and that's where we have a community of women of color as well as allies and advocates who kind of sign up to join the community, where we kind of share resources and events and programming as well as kind of announcements. So they can sign up to that. We have community meetups. So these are 4 times a year, each quarter. We bring in some really interesting kind of guests who talk about some really great relevant kind of topics that I think would be helpful to both women of color as well as allies and advocates. So keep an eye out for that so folks can join. All our programming are either free or very, very low cost just to keep things accessible. And we've been self-funded from the very start. So we do have like a crowdfunding campaign going on our website that they can access if you'd like to kind of contribute. And now that we're kind of moving into kind of deeper programming and whatnot, I think what we're kind of focusing on is, fundraising and mapping donors and funders who are able to kind of support our work. So, if there's people who are interested in partnering or funding this kind of programming, then it's always great to hear from people. Yeah, I think those are some of the ways, and follow us on LinkedIn, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And so to our listeners, you'll see their information in the show notes. So now it's time for our signature question. And I would love for each of you to answer this question. Can you please fill in the blank? I amplify.
Sure. I amplify the wisdom, lived experience, and the bravery of women of color everywhere so they can mobilize, dismantle, and lead with compassion, integrity, and care.
I amplify the voices and stories of all Indigenous folks from Turtle Island all the way to Palestine.
Wonderful, wonderful answers from both of you. I'm thinking about what you each said, and just, again, I want to say thank you both for being here and sharing each of your insights. Hanieh and Zahra, you both had really amazing perspectives, and it was really cool to hear all the innovative things you're doing with 1001 and the impact that's going to be enabling in our world. And I just want to step back and reflect on some of the things that I appreciate about our conversation, just to celebrate both of you as being incredible leaders for underrepresented founders. So something which I thought was interesting and which I really appreciate. Again, so as someone who is a man of color living in the US, I mean, my mom and my sister really have greatly impacted me. I've supported many women of color through mentorship, other types of roles. I think, as you've talked about, there's a very unique intersectionality, and also there's a very broad diversity in the experiences of women of color specifically. And I appreciate that you're bringing that front and center into how you're programming things. I think also something else that's amazing is how you are thinking, you're very thoughtful about your programming, how you're very intentional about things like, again, balancing self and collective care, like bringing, as we've talked about, holding space for joy, in addition to rage and challenge in what you're doing, and really, again, reflecting an evolved, more revolutionary, if we want to use that word, truly regenerative in the most radical sense of that word, way in which one can go ahead and promote change in a collectively grounded, very engaging, very authentic, and in the highest sense of that word way. So I appreciate seeing and hearing about that and how you're programming things. And then I think the third thing, which is important, you talked about this in your long-term vision. I think there is, it's evident that you have not only interfaced with feminism and such ideologies, your own politics in a intellectual level, and you understand that very deeply, but you also bring them and embody them in what you do in your vision. So for example, you talked about the vision of having really quality reciprocal relationships. I think that's so important. Really, like, you've talked about in multiple places how ensuring that like women of color feel really like whole in like their own ways. You talked about, I also mentioned the interdependence of like identity and impact, et cetera. And it's amazing to see how like you bring those into the program, you bring those into what you're sharing, and you bring those into how you approach the work, bringing your lived experiences as well as co-design with who you're like supporting in what you do. So thank you both for that.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Narayan, for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
You're most welcome. And so I'm very excited to see what you all are doing and to understand the amazing things that will be in your future. But as our conversation is at its close, I'd like to say bye for now for both of you. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Founders Amplified. I hope you're feeling as inspired as I am. If you'd like to learn more about our guests and support them, check out the show notes for their details. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a rating, share it with someone you know, and follow us for more inspiring episodes like this one. If you're a founder who is driving innovation and impact in any industry or sector anywhere in the world and would like to be a guest, we'd love to hear from you. Check out the show notes for more information. And finally, remember that you, yes, you, have the power to amplify the voices around you. Whether you're a colleague, family member, friend, funder, mentor, or just another fellow human, your support matters. So I invite you to celebrate and uplift the underrepresented innovators in your life who are driving innovation and impact. Let's create a better future for everyone, together. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and keep amplifying.